Welcome back. This is The Firm. In 2013, companies worldwide raised $9 billion via depository receipts. India's contribution to that figure stood at a mere $40 million with only 2 Luxembourg listings. Now, regulatory constraints such as capital controls, choice of underlying securities, pricing, end-use restrictions on funds raised, all of these have resulted in corporates making little or no use of this route. So last year, the Finance Ministry set up a committee chaired by former SEBI whole-time member MS Sahu to suggest relevant changes to India's regulatory framework for depository receipts. Paiswini Upadhyay reports on the top 5 proposed changes and whether they will serve the purpose of revitalizing this route.
RBI's Foreign Exchange Management Act is the governing framework for depository receipts or DRs. The regulations were first introduced in 1993 and since then have evolved to expand or contract the pool of companies allowed to issue DRs, harmonized the DR regime with the FDI policy and developed links between international and domestic market. The existing framework allows companies to do a capital raising sponsored DR issue. In a sponsored DR, an Indian issuer enters into an agreement with a foreign depository for creation or issue of DRs on the back of shares. In an unsponsored DR, the issuer is not involved. The first key suggestion by the Sahu Committee intends to deepen the DR market. It has proposed DR issuances on the back of all securities such as shares, scrips, stocks, bonds, debentures, debenture stock or other marketable securities, and a wider list of issuers including listed or unlisted companies, mutual funds, government or any other issuer.
I think the one really positive move from the expansion of the DR eligibility criteria, making it broad-based to include listed, unlisted companies, including both sponsored programs and unsponsored programs, whether capital raising or for non-capital raising purposes. There's always been a demand for Indian single stocks, which whether it's high net worth individual or institutions that are not directly regulated in India but have wanted some limited exposure to Indian the top 100 listed stocks, for example, are always in demand. For those purposes, if they don't have a sponsored DR program, for example, in the US, it helps them actually be able to subscribe to or have exposure to the Indian stocks directly. Currently, the only way you would do it would be through the P-note route, which neither the investors necessarily like because it's expensive, you have counterparty risk with respect to the bankers, and definitely, as we have seen, the regulators don't like. So this would be a good avenue for meeting that demand and actually creating more liquidity for some of the Indian listed companies.
Existing instruments, as you would know, they were largely capital raising instruments. So they were restricted to the set of Indian companies which want to raise capital. Now, raising capital it's a fairly complex process, and there are significant compliance requirements around, be it US GAR, US SOX compliance, so it's not an easy process. Now, what the Sahu Committee recommendation around Level 1 DR does is that it gives Indian companies a very easy way to have their stocks traded in overseas jurisdictions. Because under Level 1 DRs and unsponsored DRs, there is no need to comply with US GAR, there is no need to be SOX compliant. It's a fairly simple listing and trading process, trading process. It allows the Indian companies to test the waters, if you will. So in a very easy fashion, they can have the stocks traded in the US. They can gauge the demand and interest amongst overseas investors in this stock. And should the experience be good, it can then be almost like a stepping stone to move on to a level 2 or to a full-fledged capital raising program.
The second important suggestion relates to pricing. Under the existing regulations, unlisted companies are allowed to price DRs based on DCF valuation. The committee recommends that pricing norms can be subverted and so no pricing guidelines should be prescribed. This suggestion is in line with the regulations in most mature jurisdictions like the US and the UK.
I think any sort of pricing norms don't work. We've done them in the past purely for protectionist policies towards domestic industry, which is understandable as the economy is growing. But if we are really allowing such broad-based globalization of our capital markets, then for them to really work, we have to do away with the pricing restrictions. We've seen they just don't work. All they do is create more complications, which a lot of people outside India don't understand. That's not a global phenomena. That's not how global markets work.
The third proposed change is on the purpose for which DRs can be issued. The existing regulations place end-use restrictions on money raised via DRs. The funds cannot be used to invest in the stock market and real estate. The suggestion is to remove these restrictions, which experts say may not be acceptable to the regulators.
I would be very surprised if they did away with that recommendation of the SAHU committee just because of what it involves. I think they don't want people to be raising money outside India, investing in real estate or putting it in the public markets. So I don't think that is probably going to change. I think it's a good step. I think it generally opens it up, but I think on the DR side of it, that is still pretty open. So I don't think people have actually, there are not many issuers out there who want to go and raise money and then invest in real estate. Effectively, what it meant was that real estate companies probably couldn't raise money, but given that there are already FDI restrictions in real estate, it was, those were not going to be the companies that were going to do DRs anyway.
In the fourth important change, the committee has examined the issue of public shareholding in relation to DRs. In a sponsored DR, where a company is the issuer, the consequences of the DR issue on the shareholding are known to it. But in an unsponsored DR, where any public shareholder may have transferred the underlying shares to a depository, may cause concerns for the company in the context of minimum public shareholder norms. To address this concern, the committee has suggested that the underlying shares can be counted as public shareholding if the DR holders have a voting right on it.
Currently also there is really, issuers can decide if they want the DRs to be voting or non-voting. I think the way it generally works is you give the depository has the right to decide where, in the depository agreement generally it's how the board of directors asks the depository to vote. The board of directors votes on behalf of, on the depository. I think what the committee has said, which is interesting, which, impacts and probably positively impacts listed companies in India that may be looking to do an outside listing, is that those DRs will count towards the public shareholding float in India if the underlying holder of the DR has the right to vote. So I think that has been one of the reasons why a lot of people have not been wanting to do DRs on top of an Indian list co. Is you have to do 25% public float, and then on top of that you do a DR program. So you're effectively, for a large issuer, asking them to do 30-35% of public float, which can be a lot of money which they may not actually need as well.
Unsponsored DRs, as you rightly mentioned, the company doesn't involve or appoint any one bank. So theoretically, there could be multiple banks issuing unsponsored DRs on the same underlying security. It does become a big challenge. I think one of the ways to do it is if, let's say, there are 3 or 4 big depository banks having a bulk of the DRs out there, they could maybe work together to see what's the best way. But there are challenges around this one. And globally, as I said, it's not done. So I think it'll be something unique.
The fifth and last important proposed change relates to taxation of DRs. The committee has recommended that DR returns and transactions should be treated similar to any other underlying security. The current regime imposes a capital gains tax, and the recommendation is that DR transactions should be taxed similar to sale of shares on a stock exchange on which STT is applicable. If these recommendations of the SAHU committee are implemented, experts say it will put India way ahead of other emerging markets in terms of a friendly regulatory regime. In Mumbai, Payaswini Upadhyay.
And with that, we're entirely out of time on the firm. Thanks very much for watching. Do stay in touch. You know how to do that. And I do hope you're also following our Companies Act series. We'll see you next week.